If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism. Hey everybody, welcome back to this third episode in this little mini-series calling Seeking Roots, Finding the Church. Now, if you've listened to the first 2 episodes, we've been digging into why it is that American Protestant evangelicals are so drawn to a sort of Jewish Holy Land identity rather than seeking an identity in the historic Catholic Church or even Eastern Orthodoxy. In episode 1, we talked about why their love for the sort of romanticized image of Galilee, Passover meals and Holy Land trips and all this kind of stuff and blowing shofar horns or whatever, is driven by them chasing a sort of simple, imagined pre-Christian faith while sidelining the actual traditions of the church because they have a need for a tradition. They have a need for roots. They have a need for gravitas for their faith. And because they don't want to accept the Catholic or Orthodox church history tradition, they leapfrog backwards to this sort of early year zero or rooted in the Old Testament. And in the last episode, we unpacked why it is that the Protestant Old Testament subtracted 7 books, and how that effectively was choosing a canon made by Jewish rabbis in the Middle Ages over the Old Testament canon that was used by the apostles in the early church. And today we're going to take on a big hot issue, especially in the news these last couple of weeks, and that is why is it that American evangelicals are so committed to the modern political state of Israel. So we're seeing this because of the recent conflicts with Iran and this and that. And I've gotten a ton of emails and questions from some of you about how, like, Senator Ted Cruz kind of stepped in it the other day in some interview a week or 2 ago, saying that Christians must support the modern state of Israel because they're God's biblical people. And he quotes Genesis 12:3 and says, those who bless Israel will be blessed. And so therefore, in order to receive God's blessing, we must bless the modern state of Israel because it is contiguous with the Israel of the Old Testament. And the question I get from a lot of you, is this the Catholic Church's view? The short answer is no. So in this episode, we're going to explore the sort of cultural and theological reasons behind this passion, including a little American cowboy spirit, and why the church, not the modern state of Israel, is the true home for God's covenant. So let's dive in. But before we get to the theology part of this, I need to give a disclaimer. So what I'm going to do in the next couple of minutes is I'm going to take off my Catholic hat, my Catholic teacher, apologist, whatever I am, podcaster hat, and I'm just going to put on my American hat. I'm just speaking as an American citizen, albeit a Christian and a fairly conservative one. So what I'm about to say comes from that space, not me speaking from the perspective of a Catholic. And I have to say that as an American, I understand the tendency to support the modern political state of Israel and its conflicts. It has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with the Bible. I think Europeans, and we have a lot of European listeners, and I get emails from a lot of you. And I'm going to go back pretty much my whole life. My European friends have never really understood something about America? Because over the last 40, 50 years, I have heard any number of Europeans will say, oh, you Americans, you just acting like a cowboy. You're like cowboys, or you think you're a cowboy. And you use the word cowboy like it's an insult. And what I don't think you grasp is that for Americans, cowboys are a good thing, right? Cowboys are good guys. We like cowboys. So when you say, oh, you Americans, you think you're a bunch of cowboys or you're acting like cowboys, you go, yeah. And so when I think a lot of Americans look at the modern political state of Israel, what they see is a story over the last 50, 70 years or whatever it's been of a scrappy group of settlers that came into a hostile place surrounded by enemies. And out of the desert, they built farms and cities and technologies and industries. They innovated like crazy. They built the Israeli tech industry and publishing industry, and everything is really sophisticated. And they made the desert bloom, and they did it against all odds, right? You think about the various wars that they've been in, the various attacks that they've been under, 6-Day War, others, the War of Independence, the 67 War, whatever, all of these things where they're under massive attack, surrounded by enemies, like Davy Crockett at the Alamo, and they fight back. And they fight back clever, brilliant. You think about the Mossad pulling off that Stuxnet virus, the computer virus that messed up Iran's centrifuges. That was 10 years ago or something. And then the crazy thing with the pagers, the exploding pagers. Again, they're like Davy Crockett at the Alamo. They're outmanned, outgunned, except in this version of the Alamo, they're winning. And they turn their patch of desert into this powerhouse. And you've got to understand, from an American perspective, we eat that up. We love bold pioneers. We love risk takers. We love fighters who build something great against impossible odds. It's like why we like the movie Braveheart. I know friends from Scotland who are like, oh, Braveheart is historically totally wrong and doesn't understand anything. You go, I know, but we love it, right? It's the Wild West. It's fighting against impossible odds and coming out on top. That's how Americans like to see themselves. And then you contrast it with how a lot of Americans see Israel's enemies. Now, I worked for many years for some evangelical organizations that did missions to Muslims in that part of the world. I actually contributed to 3 books as a contributor or editor about Islam. I've dealt with people in that part of the world. I know a lot of people in that part of the world. I get all the nuances, but right now I'm just trying to explain this sort of American pro-Israel bias. And from an American perspective, you look at a lot of that and you go, yeah, sure, there's a lot of distinctions, but look, from the American perspective, what we see is people shouting death to America, knocking down our towers, hating our way of life, blowing stuff up, condemning us all the time. And then you look over in Israel and they're kind of like Davy Crockett at the Alamo, the scrappy fighters who do something. And Israel never says, we're going to blow you up or death to America. It feels like a kindred spirit, guts, brains, military smarts. They don't hate us. So everything I just said right now is not with my Catholic apologist hat on. I'm just trying to explain to my European listeners why Americans, tend to like Israel. And it doesn't always have anything to do with theology or the Bible or anything. It's just the American personality cheering for an underdog who seems more like us and who's punching up. And I can't deny that as an American that's how it comes across. But now I'm going to take my American hat off and put my Catholic hat on and say that everything I just said is not the Catholic position. And I think it's only half the story for evangelicals. But the reason I wanted to say that is because, again, I get all kinds of questions from people like, why is it that American Christians support Israel? And is this the way, Catholic? And it must be some kind of weird theological thing. And I'm going to get into the theology and the evangelical theology about Israel here. But I want to say theology aside, there's a lot of reasons why American Christians tend to default to supporting Israel. Because it does go beyond just admiring cowboys, although we admire cowboys. There is a theological dimension to it, and it's involved with everything that we've been talking about in this little mini-series. So let's dive in. I'm back to switch on my Catholic apologist mode or whatever, put that hat back on. We've been talking in the last couple of episodes about how evangelicals chase a tradition, a gravitas, a root for their theology, and because they don't want to choose tradition or identity or find that in the historic church of 2,000 years, the Catholic Church or even Eastern Orthodoxy, that they leapfrog back to this kind of Holy Land identity that, again, gives them a sense of family legacy, or their religion a sense of legacy and heritage, roots. So we talked about that the first episode. We talked about that last time when we talked about the Masoretic Text. But it also sets the stage for why they're so politically committed to modern Israel. And this comes from a theology that some American evangelicals have called dispensationalism. Now, there are some American evangelicals who, if you said, do you believe in dispensationalism, would say, yes, I do, and be able to articulate that. Most of them, and I can say this having lived and worked in that world, most of them are unaware of this. They don't think about that. They don't identify with that. They don't even maybe really know what the word means. But it is baked into a lot of evangelical culture. Just like there's a lot of cradle Catholics who don't really understand the doctrines of the Catholic Church and couldn't articulate them, there's a lot of evangelicals who don't understand or articulate their own doctrines, but they've grown up in church swimming in that pond and just ingesting it without realizing it. So let's talk about this thing called dispensationalism. It was cooked up in the 19th century by a guy named John Nelson Darby. And it was spread through something called the Scofield Reference Bible. It's this Bible that was published, American Bible published, and it was a reference Bible, so it had like footnotes and notes, and all the footnotes and notes that would explain Bible passages did it through the lens of dispensationalism. And the Scofield Reference Bible was so popular for like 100 years or 50 or 100 years in America that people just said, hey, what does this verse mean? What does this verse mean? I'll look at the footnote in my Bible and it tells me. And they were ingesting dispensationalism, maybe without even realizing it. So here's what dispensationalism is. It says that God works through these different dispensations or eras of time, and that right now we are living in one where Israel, the nation of Israel, not the church as the new Israel, the nation of Israel is central to God's end times plan. So they go back to passages like Ezekiel 37 about the dry bones coming to life, or passages in Daniel and Revelation get read as prophecies about modern Israel's restoration and its conflicts, like the one with Iran, as signs of the second coming of Christ. So when all these things are happening to the modern political state of Israel, it's setting us up for the second coming of Christ, the end times. And that's why some evangelicals treat Israel's wars as straight up like eschatology, dealing with the end times, like we're watching the book of Revelation play out. Now, let's tie this back to our series. In episode 1, we said evangelicals want a faith with gravitas, so they lean into this Jewish past. And in episode 2, we saw how their Bible, the Masoretic Text, keeps their focus on Old Testament promises about land and nationhood, not the church's fulfillment in Christ. And dispensationalism takes that and runs with it, saying that Israel's not just a historical root that blooms in the church, that Israel, the nation of Israel, is the key to the future and bringing about the second coming of Christ. But see, here's the question. Is that actually what Jesus and the apostles taught? So let's go back through the teaching of the Catholic Church, which goes back to Jesus and the apostles, and see what has historically been Orthodox Christian teaching. Now, the Catholic Church has a clear take. It is the church, not modern Israel, is Israel. Like the church is the new Israel. It is the fulfillment of God's Old Testament promises. So, as I mentioned last time, Romans 9, 6-8 says it straight. Not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel. It is the children of the promise who are counted as offspring. Galatians 3:29 says, if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. That's the church that was founded by Jesus on the rock of St. Peter. Again, Matthew 16, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraphs 60 and 781 to 786, nails it. It says that God's covenant with Israel finds its completion in Christ and his church, not a geopolitical nation. So, what about Senator Ted Cruz's claim on television a couple of weeks ago that Christians must support modern Israel as God's people in order to be blessed by God? The Catholic answer is no. The Catholic would say modern Israel is a nation state, and Catholics approach it like any other nation state, with charity, justice, call for peace, etc., etc., per the Catechism, paragraphs 2309 to 2317, on just war, peacemaking, so on, forth, and so on. The Second Vatican Council in the 1960s said that we respect Judaism for its historical role in salvation, but that the church is the new covenant, the universal family of God. There's no theological mandate to treat the modern state of Israel as the center of God's plan today. And its conflicts, like with Iran, aren't some end times checklist for the second coming of Christ. And again, this ties back into our series here. Because in episode 1, again, we saw evangelicals chasing this sort of pre-Christian Jewish identity, preferring Galilee over St. Peter's Basilica. In episode 2, we unpacked why they trust an Old Testament that's not the Old Testament of the early church. And both of those choices make it easy to see modern Israel, not the church, as their spiritual home. But Jesus didn't tell the apostles to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. He gave them keys to build a church that stretches from Rome all the way to your hometown. And that's the real fulfillment of God's promise. So let's bring this home for my evangelical friends. I get why you're drawn to Israel. And part of it is, again, taking my hat on, taking my hat off. I'm an American like you. I love cowboys. I love the cowboy spirit. I love scrappy Israel, fighting against all odds, building a modern state, not shouting death to America, knocking our buildings down. I love all of that. And it's inspiring. And yeah, I feel the pull to that too. If there's a fist fight going between this guy and this guy, and I'm more inclined to this guy because I share all these qualities with him, right? I tend to be rooting for him. And so I get that for us as Americans, that gets us halfway there. But when you try to draw the Bible and theology and doctrine in, the theological side, and you start drawing in dispensationalism, end times prophecy, we have to support the state of Israel because that'll bring about the second coming of Jesus. And if you think that's giving your faith a sort of cosmic weight, like you're part of God's big story, then I think you're missing it. Because the Catholic Church, the church of history, has all of that gravitas and more. The Catholic Church isn't just a museum of Holy Land traditions, and nor is it just positioning itself for some end times rapture when the modern political state of Israel takes back the Temple Mount and rebuilds the second temple or the third temple or whatever. The Catholic Church is a living family built on Peter and Paul with the Eucharist as Christ's real presence, and it ties you back to 2,000 years of believers. Go back and read Lumen Gentium from Vatican II, or check out the Catechism. Go to paragraphs 781 to 786. It's all about the church as God's people, the new Israel. And to my cradle Catholic listeners that are rediscovering your faith, don't let the world's focus on nations like Israel or even America pull you away from your heritage. The church isn't tied to one flag. The word Catholic means universal. That's literally what the word means. It's a universal church. That's literally what I say in the intro to this show every episode, right? One church covering 20 centuries, 24 time zones, 2 hemispheres, encompassing every language, tribe, nation, or race. It's not linked to Israel. It's not linked to America. It's not linked to Italy or Brazil. It's the Catholic Church. And its universality fulfills Israel's promises in Christ, from Jerusalem to Rome to every corner of the globe. You can't really have corners of the globe because it's a sphere, I get it. But I've heard so many of you say that you started reading the church fathers, you started digging into history, you started going back to Ignatius of Antioch and realizing that the church's apostolic roots, all the way back to the first century, are the home that you'd been searching for. That's what happened to me and why I'm here today. And maybe it's for you too. Ask yourself, is your faith rooted in some sort of national identity, either Israel's or America's? Or is it rooted in the church that spans 20 centuries, 24 time zones, 2 hemispheres? So anyway, thanks for joining me on this little mini-series knocked out this week. If you missed episodes 1 or 2, check them out in the archive on Spotify or Apple or whatever. Let me know what you think, and I'll be back with a new topic in a couple of days. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with another episode soon. But before you go, can I quickly ask you to do 5 things? First, please rate the podcast on whatever platform you listen on. That really moves it up in search rankings. Second, please write a review on either Apple Podcasts or on our website, consideringcatholicism.com. That encourages others who are searching for a Catholic podcast to try this one out. Third, please share it with others. Send them a link or post an episode on your social media. Fourth, please write me at consideringcatholicism.com or leave a comment on our website. I'd love to hear your comments, your questions, and your stories. And finally, this podcast is 100% donor supported. My donors keep me going, they help cover my costs, and they let me dedicate more time to researching, writing, recording, and editing to get the episodes out to you faster. So please consider giving a one-time or recurring donation through the links in the show notes or on the website so that this ministry can continue and grow. And never forget, Christus vincit, Christus regnat, and Christus imperat.